Can you feel something? The praise, the thank you. When you think about that first Thanksgiving, we heard about the Mayflower coming over and the people stopping because there they were. They thought they were going to Virginia. They had a charter for Virginia, which had all its laws from the king under which they would live. And then all of a sudden they found themselves not off the coast of Virginia, but Cape Cod. And in that case, the charter was absolutely no good. So there were no laws. There was nothing to govern them. And they decided to bind themselves together as a community in a covenant, in a sacred promise, because they didn't want the elderly and those with children to go without food. And if everybody, the strong and the young, went off and they just went their own ways, they might have survived. But what about the older people? What about the children and the families? And so they said, no, we won't do this. We're going to stop the ship before we go on shore, and we're going to hear a sermon, and then we are going to make a decision. I like that part about hearing a sermon. And they're going to make a decision. How do we want to live when we go on to this new land? We don't know what it's going to be like. We don't know what we're going to find. We don't know how to fish there. We don't know how to farm there. We just have to go into this land, in this place we're not expecting to be, and we got to make our own way. Virginia is pretty warm throughout all the seasons, but Cape Cod is not. And in fact, nearly half their members died during that first winter. Imagine. Now let's go back to what we just heard, that song, that sense of praise, that sense of thankfulness. These were people who a year after landing on those shores had buried 50 out of 102, I believe, of their women, men, and children. This was one of the most sorrowful years you could ever imagine. And there they were. Finally, in the first harvest, they'd learned, thanks to the native people, how to farm, how to fish, how to catch lobsters and things. And they had a feast together. I don't know if we can even imagine. We have running water, we have electricity, we have homes, and if you don't, let me know, because we'll make sure that you do. And they were standing there in this foreign land, trying to bind themselves together with a promise. And they did. And we are thankful that they did. And we're a continuation of that tradition of people who live together in a covenant, who put the common good of the community above their own self-interest. And it was an incredible thing then, in 1620. It's an incredible thing now. And when I look out and I see your face, and I hear the children sing, and I just say to myself, thank God for the abundance of our lives and for each other. I want to tell you a story. Back in 1998, I was a ministerial intern, still studying to become a minister, back in Boston, Massachusetts. And I was serving a church there where there had been a fire 30 years earlier. So this was the anniversary of a fire that burned down the entire church. And they decided to rebuild the church after the fire, but people protested. Now, this was the late 60s. And there was a lot of protesting going on back then. Some of you were part of that. And people protested because they said, we have enough churches in Boston. We don't need another church. What we need is affordable housing for the poor. Why don't you take that insurance money and all the other money that you raised to rebuild your church and give it to build affordable housing for those who need it most. As a matter of fact, they said to spend all those millions of dollars on yourself, on the church, is immoral. They actually disrupted the Sunday services with sit-ins. And one time they had to call the police. They had to call off the service completely because of the disruption. They said Boston needs affordable housing a lot more than it needs one more church. And it was a compelling argument. Was it not selfish then for the church to spend all that time and all that money on themselves when there were people who needed a home, when there was so much to be done for the poor? And now, fast forward 30 years And I'm delivering a sermon on the 30th anniversary of that fire in that church. So obviously, the congregation decided to rebuild their church instead of the affordable housing. But I will tell you, it was not a unanimous decision. There was a lot of debate. There was some division. There was conflict about what to do. And they voted and they decided to rebuild their church, and they came back together and they did it. And in my sermon, I said, have you seen the affordable housing that they put up in Boston in the late 60s and early 70s? Because it's crumbling, it's condemned, or it's been torn down. Whereas this church was strong, and you could tell it was going to be strong well into perpetuity. And then I listed the things that the church had done over those 30 years. A list that I could now add another 12 years on top of. But I talked about the homes that they created for the elderly. I talked about the homes that they created for those with AIDS in their community. The meals that they served to the homeless. I talked about the events that they sponsored and the speakers that they brought into the community to talk about the issues of the day that were important, that no one else was bringing in, that no one else would give an audience. The reforms that they helped to usher through in the education system for women's rights, for LGBT rights, and for so much more. And I told them, you know what? We could add all this together. All the things, the incredible organizations that the church had founded and supported, and all the direct service that they'd given. I said, and it's amazing, truly amazing. And yet, there's one thing that they had done that made an exponentially greater impact than all of the other things. And you know what it is? It's the same thing that we do here in this church. That is greater than everything else that we could do to create justice and a better world. More than all the churches we've adopted, more than all the meals we've served, more than all the houses we've rebuilt and the banks that we've started in Central America, more than all of that combined. And that is so important. And those things are saving lives and changing lives all over the world and throughout this community. But more than all of that, we do one thing that will have an even greater impact. And that is that we educate our children, you, children, in the ways of living in covenant and caring about the common good. In my church in Boston, I started to list the names of children who had been raised there and the things that they were doing, from Washington, D.C. to the Boston school system, to the nonprofits that they started or were directing, or the boards that they sat on, the things that they'd done in the arts, in the law community, in business, and throughout the world that they had done to make change and to create a better world. And I realized, and everybody realized, that what they do, what you will do, will overshadow everything that we as a church could ever do. The greatest impact that we'll ever have is the impact that we have by raising our children to have the kind of passion for justice and a better world that we have. The Mayflower Compact was a covenant to care more for the common good than our own self-interest. When those two things came into conflict, to choose the good of the community. While the world outside says compete, we say love. While the world says get and then take some more, we say serve and then serve some more, because service is our law. When the world outside is filled with wars and conflicts, we say every Sunday, dwell together in peace. While religion is a source of strife, we say seek the truth in love. While the world says help yourself, we say help one another. We are a people who choose to be bound together, not by creed or doctrine, but by a covenant, by a sacred promise we make with one another every week that we come into this church. We're not a social service agency. We're a church that does service in the world. But the biggest impact we'll ever have, as I've said, is to teach our children to have that same kind of passion for life and for justice. Those protesters in 1968, they argued that investing in a church was selfish, when in fact investing in a church like this one is probably the single most effective way that any of us will ever create real and lasting and sustainable change in this world. Into perpetuity, for generations to come, for those yet unborn. We have so much to be thankful for this season, don't we? Our children, our church, our covenant, and more than all, the love that binds us together as one. God bless you. I love you. Happy Thanksgiving. Amen.